Welcome to No Self-Actualization. This is Lesson 2, the second noble truth. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to continue our journey through the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, specifically the second noble truth. I've been contemplating this truth for quite a while and think that you may be surprised at just how insightful it can be, how it holds up to scrutiny, and how it can and will affect your life when applied practically. Before moving on, though, if you have not read or listened to the lesson on the first noble truth, please do so. You can find that by clicking the link here. It's important for you to go in order in which the lessons are presented. Otherwise, some of the material may not make sense. Think of walking into a movie at the midpoint and not understanding the plot. Obviously, you wouldn't, because the midpoint is only understandable with the context of the movie that came before. These lessons are the same in the sense that the following lesson only makes sense with the context of the previous lesson. None of these noble truths work in isolation either. They only work and make sense in their relational aspects to each other. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started. What is the second noble truth? In the first noble truth lesson, we learned that there is dukkha, aka suffering. We also learned that dukkha has three characteristics, namely dissatisfaction, impermanence, and conditioned states. Now that we know suffering exists, we can figure out that there is a cause to that suffering. In fact, the second noble truth is the noble truth of the cause of suffering. This is the Buddha's claim that because suffering exists, there must be a cause to its existence. Instead of giving you the noble truth in my words, I'm going to give it to you straight from the Buddha. Quote, "And this, monks, is the noble truth of the origination of dukkha, the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there, i.e., craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming." Unquote. Gautama Buddha, from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So, what does he mean by craving? Tanha, aka craving. Tanha is taken from the Pali Canon, which literally translates as thirst. Many scholars use the word craving instead. The Buddha actually stated that there are three types of tanha, or craving. For our purposes in this lesson, we're going to use the word craving when talking about tanha. The three types of craving are as follows. Bhava tanha, craving for becoming. This is the craving and attachment to our identity. Remember the Buddha's doctrine of anatman. Kama tanha, craving for sensual pleasures. This is the craving for sense objects, which give us sensory pleasures. Think of power or money, objects of sexual desires, also ideals, concepts, and beliefs. This is generally referred to as lust. This is where the word desire makes its appearance. Vibhava tanha, craving for non-existence. This is the craving and attachment to not experience unpleasant things, situations, and people. What is fascinating about these cravings is that they have commonly been related to the three poisons at the heart of samsara, the wheel of life. By the way, I plan on having an article going in depth about samsara in the near future. The three poisons are ignorance, which is the basis for tanha. Once again, building off of the core teaching of the Buddha, the doctrine of anatman. Attachment, which is essentially kama tanha and bhava tanha to a large extent. And lastly, aversion or resistance, which is vibhava tanha. For our purposes, we're going to be discussing the second noble truth through the lens of ignorance, attachment, and resistance. Ignorance. Ignorance is basically thinking that what you don't know or cannot see doesn't exist. In Buddhism, if a person is said to be ignorant, it essentially means that they are ignorant as to the ultimate manner in which the self and phenomena exist. Once again, the Buddha is referring to anatman, or no self. This is why ignorance is the basis for tanha, or craving, and the first poison on the wheel of samsara. We can be, and often are, ignorant of our conception of ourself. We have a hard time seeing anything outside of what we perceive as a self. We also tend to think of our success as independent of our environment, the so-called self-made millionaire. Attachments. When we cling to anything, we suffer. This is rather obvious when we understand the impermanence of reality. Remember the example of the employee of the month in the first lesson. He is suffering because he is attached to the idea, concept of employee of the month. He is also attached to the sense pleasures that could come with that title, more money, for instance. He also has attached his identity to his position. So if and when this employee of the month title is taken away, which it inevitably will be due to impermanence, he is bound to suffer if he has attached it to his identity. Resistance. This is the suffering we feel when we resist what is. You get cut off in traffic and start cursing the other driver, or you grow impatient while waiting in rush hour traffic, or someone said something to you that you perceive to be a slight. When we resist any dissatisfaction, regardless of what it is, we suffer. Going deeper. An interesting aspect about all three of these causal forms is that it's not the thing, person, place, or situation that is causing your suffering. Rather, the Buddha is pointing out it's the ignorance, attachments, and resistance to these things that is, in fact, causing your suffering. When we identify as a self, there is always going to be suffering in one way or another. Why? Because we are ignorant of our impermanence and conditioned states. We are ignorant of the interconnectedness of everything. Nothing is ever truly owned in this world. Everything is borrowed. True ownership implies a self to own. And the Buddha's whole message is about annihilation of the self. If you're truly connected in a profound way, then why would you ever lie, cheat, steal, sexually abuse someone, or kill someone? Doing so is like hurting yourself. It's like a snake eating its own tail. It actually makes no sense. When we attach ourselves to anything, we will suffer. Why? Because of the impermanence of everything. To cling to your desires like money, sex, beauty, or power is to live in a fantasy world. To cling to the idea of a self that is somehow separate from everything else, yet simultaneously surrounded by and influenced by everything else, is to cause massive suffering. When we resist reality, we will suffer. Why? Because it's happening regardless of our perception of it. To resist it is to try and control it. It would be like trying to control the wind. No amount of resistance to the driver who cut you off in traffic changes the fact that the situation happened. So, why resist it? A quick note on desire. If you look closely at the three types of craving, it seems clear that the Buddha is not saying that all desires cause suffering. I'm sure many of you can see that without certain desires, we would be very lonely, malnourished, thirsty, and probably would not be alive. Think about the simple thought that I'm thirsty. When you have such a thought, this is your unconscious mind sending a signal to your conscious mind desiring to supply water to your body to stay hydrated. There is nothing wrong with needing to hydrate. There is nothing wrong with biologically derived desires, such as food and water, shelter, social companionship, and good friends. These are all perfectly healthy, natural desires. And like I said, without most, if not all of these, you could not survive, and probably would have never have been born in the first place. Quote, those who act with few desires are calm, without worry or fear. End quote. Gautama Buddha. It is common for many new to Buddhism to get logic trapped in the word desire. Buddhism is ultimately about achieving a goal, a desire. Think about getting rid of your lust, hatred, and ignorance, and in turn, flowering generosity, kindness, and clarity. This is why the Buddha stated many times, quote, my teaching is like a finger pointing to the moon. Do not mistake the finger for the moon. End quote. Gautama Buddha. If you find yourself still struggling over this topic, please see the Brahmana Sutta in the link provided. There is a great little story about a Brahmin asking the Venerable Ananda, the attendant of the Buddha, about this very issue. Conclusion. I hope at this point you've gained a better appreciation for what the Buddha taught about dukkha's cause. It is caused by our cravings for sensual pleasure, also our attachment to our cravings. It is caused by our ignorance of no self, and lastly, to our aversion or resistance to what is. Many Mindform members might be thinking that some of this sounds an awful lot like Stoicism, and I could not agree more. The Stoics also discovered aspects of this truth as well, albeit at a completely different time and place. This is one of the reasons I've begun to think that these wisdom philosophies are all pointing in the same direction. Foundational mindfulness exercise. These are all very interesting claims the Buddha is making, but if you just read this stuff and forget about it, it most likely will not change any aspect of your life. If you truly want to get to a state of no self, at some point you're going to have to ask yourself why you suffer. Over the next week, I want you to try and notice if and when you're struggling with suffering. When this inevitably happens, pay close attention to it. Watch and observe it in real time. Ask yourself where this suffering is coming from. Does it have a source? Is that source related to identification of who you believe yourself to be? Is it related to avoiding something you don't want? Or is it an attachment to some person, place, event, or object? Try and trace it back to that source and see if it matches to what the Buddha is claiming. This is a powerful exercise in cultivating awareness. I hope this lesson was helpful. As always, please feel free to leave any feedback, comments, or questions. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and hope to see you here next week. Until then, be well.